house on Maple Street stood a little apart from its neighbors, not by distance so much as by posture. It did not lean into the street with the mild sociability of the others. Its porch boards were worn thin by weather, not by visitors. The paint, once white, had dulled to a gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. People passed it without remark, and when they did remark, it was usually to say that the place had always been quiet. Hannah Grace Brennan rose each morning before the sun had fully cleared the roofs across the way. She did not need an alarm. Her body kept time better than any clock. Years on her father's farm had trained her to wake when the air was still and the day had not yet begun asking anything of her. She dressed without hurry, but without indulgence. Her clothing was plain and mended often. The seams bore the memory of her hands, stitched and restitched until the fabric had lost any original shape it might have had. She tied her hair back with care, though she no longer expected to be seen. Habit, not vanity, guided her movements. Downstairs, the house held its breath in the early hours. The boards creaked only when they had to. The air carried the faint scent of old wood, ashes from the hearth, and something damp that never quite left the cellar, no matter how often she aired it. Hannah lit the stove, boiled water, and ate sparingly. Bread, sometimes with a little butter if she could afford it. She had learned long ago that hunger dulled the mind less than fullness dulled resolve. After breakfast, she worked. The work was constant. There was sewing to be done for neighbors who did not wish to spend their own hours on it, laundry to scrub and hang, even in winter when the air cut the hands raw and the cloth froze stiff before it dried, floors to sweep, ashes to carry out, the small garden behind the house to tend when the season allowed it. Hannah did not complain of the labor. Work gave shape to the day, and shape was something she needed. Since Thomas had died, silence had taken up residence in the house. It was not an absence but a presence, thick and settled. It filled the rooms he no longer occupied. His tools still hung where he had left them, though they gathered dust now. Hannah did not move them. To do so felt like an admission she was not ready to make. Neighbors spoke to her politely when they saw her, but briefly. There was always an excuse to hurry on. She was not unkind, nor unfriendly, but she carried grief openly, and grief made people uneasy. It reminded them of their own fragile arrangements. At church, she sat in the same pew each Sunday, hands folded, eyes forward. The words washed over her without resistance, but they did not settle. She no longer expected answers. Faith, for her, had become a discipline rather than a comfort. The house required attention. It was an older structure, built before carelessness had been engineered out of things. It shifted with the seasons, doors stuck in summer and gaped in winter. Hannah learned its moods and adjusted herself accordingly. She kept notes in her head of what boards needed replacing, which sections of wall held cold longer than they should. She went into the cellar often, not because she enjoyed it, but because it needed watching. The cellar was shallow by local standards, with a low ceiling and a floor that retained moisture. It had been sufficient when the house was built, meant for storing food and little else. Hannah kept it orderly. Shelves along one wall held jars of preserves. Potatoes and onions lay in bins. She checked for rot daily. She hated waste. It was there, in the dim light below ground, that she sometimes felt the weight of the house most keenly. The earth pressed close. The air was heavier. Sounds from above arrived muted and distant, as though they had passed through layers of time before reaching her ears. She did not linger there without reason. Her evenings were quiet. She ate alone at the small table in the kitchen, facing the empty chair across from her. She did not speak aloud anymore, though there had been a time when she had. Loneliness had trained her out of that habit. After supper, she read by candlelight, scripture sometimes, other times whatever pamphlets or newspapers she could borrow. She followed the news closely. There was talk everywhere of division, of laws that tightened like a noose around those already struggling to breathe. She did not speak of her thoughts on these matters. In Lancaster, opinions were kept close, especially by women without husbands to shield them. At night, sleep came unevenly. She woke often, listening. The house made noises that had not been there before Thomas's death, or perhaps she had simply not noticed them then. A settling beam, a shift in the walls. She told herself these were ordinary things. Old houses always spoke in the dark. Winter of that year was hard but not remarkable. Snow fell and melted and fell again. Hannah kept the stove fed and the roof clear. Her hands cracked and bled. She wrapped them in cloth and continued. It was during this season that she began to notice how often she stood near the front door without recalling why. She would find herself there, hand resting on the latch, listening. There was no sound from outside. The street lay empty. After a moment, she would turn away, unsettled but unable to explain the feeling. The law weighed heavily on the town. Notices were posted. Conversations lowered when certain subjects arose. Men spoke with certainty about matters they would never have to face themselves. Hannah listened and said nothing. She had lived her life according to rules set by others. She had obeyed until obedience had cost her everything that mattered. That lesson had not left her. By early spring, the days lengthened. Light returned reluctantly, as if uncertain it was wanted. Hannah took advantage of the longer hours, working later into the evening. She found she slept less, but felt no more tired than usual. Fatigue had become her normal state. The house in those days was still only a house. It held her routines, her memories, her grief. It had not yet learned any other purpose. On a night when the air still carried winter's edge, there came a knock at the door. At first, Hannah thought she had imagined it. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. She stood still, listening. The knock came again, quieter this time, as though the hand making it feared being heard. She did not move immediately. The law was clear, so was the risk. She thought of the empty chair across from her table. She thought of Thomas's voice, calm and certain, saying things that had once seemed abstract. The knock came a third time. Hannah took a breath, reached for the candle, and went to the door. She did not yet know that this moment would divide her life into what came before and what followed. She only knew that someone stood outside in the dark and that the silence of the house had changed. She opened the door. The man at the door did not step forward when Hannah opened it. He remained where he was, just beyond the reach of the candlelight, as if unsure whether the threshold itself marked a boundary he could cross. His hat was missing. His hair lay flat against his head, damp with sweat despite the cold. His coat hung loose on his frame, the sleeves too short, the shoulders worn thin. He did not smell of drink or smoke or anything familiar. There was instead the odor of long travel, of earth and old cloth, and fear held too long in the body. "They said you might help," he told her. He spoke quietly but not weakly. His voice carried the strain of restraint, as though he had learned that loudness brought punishment. Hannah did not answer at once. She studied him in the way she had learned to study things since Thomas's death, carefully and without haste. She noted the way his weight favored one foot, the way his hands trembled when he tried to still them, the cut along his cheek, already crusted, and the swelling around his eyes that suggested little sleep. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Someone in the city," he said. "A man I trusted. He said this was a place where a person could rest." Hannah felt the words settle in her chest with a weight she did not resist. Rest. It was a modest request. It was also the one thing she had not found since Thomas died. She stepped aside. He did not thank her then. He moved quickly, as if speed itself were a form of protection. When she closed the door behind him, the house seemed to tighten around them, boards contracting with a sound like breath drawn in sharply. They stood in the narrow hall. The man looked around, not with curiosity, but with calculation. He was measuring distances, listening for sounds beyond what Hannah could hear. "My name is Nathan," he said at last. She nodded. She did not offer her own name. Names, she had learned, could be used against a person. He told her enough and no more. Maryland, 2 weeks on foot, avoiding roads, sleeping in ditches and barns when he could, running when he heard dogs. The words came without ornament. He did not seek sympathy, he sought shelter. Hannah led him into the kitchen. She set the kettle on the stove without asking if he wanted anything. His need was evident. When she unwrapped his feet, she did so with the practiced hands of someone who had tended animals and children and injuries born of labor. The soles were torn, the flesh inflamed. Infection had begun its slow work. "You should not walk on these," she said. "I know," he replied. She cleaned the wounds. She tore cloth for bandages. She gave him food. He ate with urgency but did not waste a morsel. She watched him, noting how he flinched at small sounds, how his shoulders never quite lowered even when he sat. That night, Hannah did not sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to the sounds below as Nathan shifted in the cellar. Each creak of the floor made her heart quicken. She expected, at any moment, the knock of authority, the voice that would demand entry, the men who would not ask permission. Morning came without incident. Hannah rose stiff and cold. She brought food down to the cellar and checked his bandages. His fever had not yet broken. She told him he would stay until it did. This was not an offer, it was a statement. When he left 3 days later, she gave him bread wrapped in cloth and directions written carefully on a scrap of paper she later burned. He took the paper only long enough to memorize it. Before he went, he looked at her as if to fix her face in his memory. "There will be others," he said. "Word moves faster than you think." She did not answer. For a time, nothing happened. Days passed. Hannah returned to her routines. The house resumed its familiar quiet. She told herself that the incident had been an interruption, not a beginning. Then another knock came. This time it was a woman, younger than Hannah, carrying a child bound to her back. The woman's name was Esther. She could not stand without support. Her eyes were dull with exhaustion. The child slept, untroubled by the circumstances that had driven his mother to this door. Hannah took them in without pause. She fed them. She bathed the child. She let Esther sleep for hours without interruption. When Esther woke, she spoke in fragments. Virginia, a plantation, a decision made in the night when the child's future had been decided without her consent. Hannah listened. She did not interrupt. When Esther finished, there was nothing to say that would not diminish what had been said. They stayed longer than Nathan had. The child grew stronger. Esther's ankle healed enough to bear weight. Before they left, Esther pressed Hannah's hands between her own. "God sees," she said. Hannah did not know if that was true. She knew only that the law did not. The Fugitive Slave Act was no abstraction in Lancaster. Federal marshals passed through town. Notices were read aloud. Fines were discussed openly, imprisonment as well. People who had once spoken cautiously now spoke with confidence about the necessity of enforcement. Order, property, the rights of states. Hannah heard these words as she stood in shops or sat in church. She heard what was not said as well. Fear spread quietly. It did not announce itself. It took the form of doors closed earlier in the evening, of conversations ended when a stranger entered the room, of glances exchanged and not explained. Hannah understood the danger more clearly now. Each knock at her door carried not just need, but consequence. She weighed these things in the silence of her house. She did not pray for guidance. She had learned that prayer often served those who already held power. She began to prepare. Extra food was stored. Blankets were set aside. She reorganized the cellar, clearing space where none had been intended. She told herself it was practical, that she was only making room for possibility. Others came, not often at first. A man with a limp, a pair of brothers who spoke little and trusted no one. Each arrival tightened the net around her life. Each departure loosened it slightly, but never enough. She learned to listen differently, to footsteps outside that did not belong, to the tone of voices when men spoke of the law. She learned which neighbors watched her house too closely and which looked away. The injustice revealed itself not in dramatic acts, but in routine ones, in the way authority assumed its right, in the way the suffering of certain people was discussed as if it were an inconvenience rather than a crime. Hannah saw how easily cruelty hid behind procedure. She did not speak against it, she acted around it. By the end of that year, the house on Maple Street had become known in ways Hannah could not control. Not openly, never openly, but enough that people arrived with directions written by hands she would never see. She understood now that the injustice was not a single law or a single act. It was a structure built carefully over time, supported by silence and habit. To oppose it required more than sympathy, it required risk. Hannah accepted that risk without ceremony. She did not think of herself as brave, she thought of herself as occupied. The house listened. When the knock came again, and again after that, Hannah answered. By the time the year turned, Hannah no longer marked the days by the calendar alone. She marked them by arrivals and absences, by how much food remained in the bins, by how long the cellar air stayed warm after bodies had slept there. Time had taken on a different measure, one that belonged less to the outside world and more to the rhythms of the house itself. The visits came closer together now. Where once weeks passed between knocks, now there were days, sometimes only hours. People arrived in twos and threes. Occasionally a family came together, their movements coordinated by necessity rather than trust. They spoke little at first. Hunger and fear stripped language down to its most basic uses. Hannah adjusted her routines without comment. She rose earlier, she slept less. She portioned food carefully, always holding back a little more than seemed reasonable. She learned how to stretch meals without appearing to do so. She kept her face composed even when her hands shook. The cellar was no longer sufficient as it had been. Too many people passed through, too many stayed longer than expected. Injuries healed slowly, whether delayed travel, word spread unevenly, sometimes sending several people to her door at once. She began to see the limits of what she had done. The shelves that once held preserves now pressed against one another with no room to spare. When more than 3 people hid below, the air grew stale quickly. The sound of breathing became noticeable, a collective presence that made concealment more difficult. Hannah worried about coughs, about children who could not be kept quiet without cruelty, about the simple fact of space. Fear took on new forms. It was no longer only the fear of discovery, it was the fear of inadequacy, of failing those who had already trusted her. Outside, the law asserted itself with increasing confidence. Federal marshals were seen more often in town. Notices were read aloud in public places. Men spoke with satisfaction about enforcement, about restoring order. Hannah learned to lower her eyes when these conversations occurred. She learned to carry herself with an unremarkable air, to be forgettable. She was careful not to buy supplies too frequently from the same place. She varied her routes through town. She learned which shopkeepers asked questions and which did not. When asked how she managed alone, she replied simply that she had learned to do without. At night, she listened. The house had always made noises. Old houses did. But now she listened with intent, distinguishing between familiar sounds and those that were not. She learned the difference between settling wood and movement, between wind against the siding and a footstep where none should be. She slept lightly, often in a chair rather than her bed. It was easier to rise quickly that way, easier to convince herself she was not resting when others could not. The decision to alter the cellar came not as a moment of revelation, but as an acknowledgement of necessity. She did not tell herself she was doing something extraordinary. She told herself she was making room. She hired a man who spoke little English. He gave his name as Friedrich. He asked few questions and took direction well. She told him she needed more storage space. He nodded and set to work. The digging was slow. The earth resisted. Hannah watched closely, offering water, paying promptly. She made certain he saw only what he needed to see. When he left each day, she inspected the work herself, measuring and remeasuring, committing the dimensions to memory. As the cellar expanded, Hannah felt both relief and unease. The new space did not behave as she expected. The walls seemed to recede slightly when she was not looking directly at them. The ceiling felt higher than it should have been. She told herself this was fatigue. She was not sleeping enough. Anyone in her position would feel the same. More people arrived. A teenage boy who had lost his way, 2 men traveling together who spoke in low tones and avoided eye contact. Hannah noted their names, their injuries, their intended destinations. She wrote these things down at first on scraps of paper she later burned, and then in a small notebook she kept hidden. It was during this period that the first disappearance occurred. Hannah did not notice immediately. That, more than anything, troubled her later. She had brought food down in the evening and spoken briefly with the men staying there. She remembered their faces. She remembered their voices. When she returned the next morning, only one remained. At first, she assumed the others had left early. Some did. Fear made people impatient. but when she asked the one who remained, he looked at her with confusion. "They were here," he said. "You know they were." She searched the cellar thoroughly. She checked the shelves, the corners, the tunnel she had not yet fully finished. There was no sign of them, no belongings left behind, no indication they had ever occupied the space. She told herself she had miscounted. She wrote a note in her book and crossed it out. She did not speak of it again. But the unease remained. As spring approached, the pressure increased. People arrived injured, sick, exhausted beyond what rest could repair. Hannah did what she could. She cleaned wounds. She brewed teas. She sat with the dying when necessary and closed their eyes afterward. She buried no one. That mercy was denied her. The house seemed to hold more than it should. Spaces felt altered. A closet appeared deeper than it had been the day before. A wall felt thicker to the touch. Hannah measured again and again, trying to reassure herself. She began to hear things at night. Not voices exactly, more like the suggestion of sound, a murmur that faded when she focused on it. She told herself it was the wind, the house settling, her own blood in her ears. She wrote more frequently now. Her entries grew longer, more detailed. She recorded not only names and dates, but impressions. The way the house felt at certain hours, the way the air changed when new people arrived. She did not share these thoughts with anyone. Authority pressed closer. A neighbor mentioned casually that marshals had asked questions. Another advised Hannah kindly to be careful. There were rumors, nothing specific. That was the danger of them. Hannah began to think in terms of containment rather than passage. She focused on keeping people hidden, safe, unseen. Departure became secondary. She told herself it was temporary, that conditions would improve, that the path north would open again. The house accommodated her thinking without protest. By the end of that season, Hannah no longer trusted her own sense of scale. Rooms felt larger when occupied, smaller when empty. Time slipped. She would begin a task and find hours gone. Still, she continued. She did not believe she had a choice. The pressure did not break her, it reshaped her, and in doing so, it reshaped the house as well. When the next line was crossed, it did not announce itself. It arrived quietly like everything else. The night the line was crossed did not announce itself with violence or alarm. There was no raised voice, no sudden intrusion from outside. The street on Maple lay as it always did after dusk, empty and still, the houses drawn inward against the cold. If anything marked the night as different, it was the absence of sound. Even the wind seemed to have withdrawn. Hannah was in the cellar when it happened. She had gone down with a lantern and a basket of food, moving carefully, as she always did now, counting her steps by habit. There were 5 people below that evening. A woman and her 2 sons, both nearly grown, and 2 men traveling together who had arrived shortly before dusk. They had spoken little. The woman had thanked Hannah more than once, as though repetition might stand in for safety. Hannah distributed the food and checked bandages where needed. She spoke quietly, keeping her voice even. She had learned that calm, when offered steadily, could settle those who had lived too long in fear. When she turned to leave, one of the men asked how long they would need to stay. "As long as necessary," Hannah replied. She did not promise more than that. She climbed the steps and closed the concealed door behind her. The shelf slid back into place with practiced ease. She paused, as she sometimes did, listening. There was nothing out of the ordinary. She returned to the kitchen and set about cleaning, though the hour was late. It was not until morning that she noticed the absence. She went down with bread and water, expecting to find 5 people waiting. Instead, she found only the woman and her sons. They sat close together, eyes wide, their posture rigid with a fear that had sharpened overnight. "The men," Hannah said, "it was not a question." "They were here," the woman said. "They did not leave. We would have heard it." Hannah searched the cellar again. She moved the shelf aside. She checked the tunnel entrance. She examined the walls for signs of disturbance. There were none. The air was colder than it had been the night before. The lantern flame burned low, though the wick was trimmed. She questioned the woman gently. The answers did not change. The men had been there. They had spoken briefly after Hannah left. One had stood to stretch his legs, then nothing, no sound of departure, no movement past them. Hannah stood for a long time in the narrow space, lantern held low, her breath visible in the cold. She felt, for the first time, a certainty she could not explain. This was not miscounting. She did not write of it immediately. She finished her tasks. She sent the woman and her sons on their way when it was safe. She watched them disappear down the street, their backs straight with effort rather than hope. Only then did she return to her diary. Her hand shook as she wrote. She described the men. She described the space they had occupied. She described the absence, careful to use plain language to avoid conjecture. She told herself that documentation was a form of control. That night she dreamed of Thomas. He was in the cellar, hammer in hand, working at a wall she did not recognize. The sound of his labor echoed endlessly, each strike answered by another deeper below. She tried to call to him, but her voice did not carry. When she woke, the sound of hammering lingered, faint but persistent. She went down to the cellar with the lantern, heart racing. The sound faded as she descended. The walls were still, the air was cold. After that, the disappearances increased. They did not follow a pattern Hannah could discern. Sometimes a single person vanished, sometimes more. Occasionally, belongings remained behind, carefully placed as though the owner intended to return. Other times, everything was gone, as if erased. Hannah began to mark the walls with chalk, simple lines to indicate who slept where, when. The marks blurred and faded more quickly than they should have. She reapplied them daily. She tested the house. She measured spaces repeatedly, counting steps, marking distances. The numbers did not hold. A passage would be longer one day and shorter the next. A room would feel cramped when occupied and expansive when empty. She told herself again and again that exhaustion was to blame, that fear altered perception, that grief had never fully loosened its hold on her. But the house did not behave like an inanimate thing. There were nights when the cellar felt full, though she knew it was not. Nights when she descended and felt the press of presence on all sides, as if walls and bodies occupied the same space. She would retreat quickly, breath shallow, lantern shaking in her hand. The law pressed closer during this time. Federal marshals came to her door twice in 1 month, each visit framed as routine. Each time, Hannah allowed them to search the house. Each time, they found nothing. During one such visit, a marshal leaned against the shelf that concealed the hidden room. His weight pressed into it. Hannah felt a sharp pain in her chest, certain the mechanism would give way. It did not. The shelf held. The marshal moved on, uninterested. When they left, Hannah went down immediately. The room behind the shelf was empty. She stood in the doorway, unable to move. The lantern guttered. The air smelled stale, as though it had not been disturbed in days. That was the moment she understood that the house was acting independently of her intentions. She did not yet assign it purpose or awareness. She did not speak of it as living, but she recognized that something had changed, that whatever had begun as concealment had become containment. She considered stopping. The thought came unbidden, and with it a wave of guilt so intense she had to sit down. To stop would mean turning people away. It would mean exposure, capture, return to conditions she had witnessed firsthand in the stories told quietly in her kitchen. She could not accept that. Instead, she went further. She hired more laborers, each for a limited task, each kept ignorant of the whole. She ordered false walls, deeper closets, narrower passages. She told herself that more control would correct what had gone wrong. The new spaces did not behave as planned. They exceeded their dimensions. They connected where no connection had been built. A door would open onto a corridor she did not remember commissioning. A passage would slope downward when no slope had been intended. People brought into the deeper spaces rarely returned to the upper cellar. Hannah told herself they were safe, that the house was doing what she could not, that hiding, truly hiding, required separation from ordinary space. She did not know where they went. She began to hear voices at night, not clearly, never clearly, more like echoes carried through stone, prayers spoken in languages she did not know, a child's humming cut short. She did not investigate every sound. She learned that some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. By the end of that year, Hannah no longer trusted the house, but she relied on it completely. She slept little. Her writing grew erratic, dates blurred, names repeated. She crossed the line not in a single act, but in the accumulation of them. In the decision to bring people into spaces she did not understand. In the choice to trust the house more than her own judgment. The injustice that had driven her to act had taken on a new form. It was no longer only imposed from outside. It had embedded itself in the walls, in the floors, in the quiet decisions made under pressure. Hannah continued. She did not know how to stop. Hannah's resistance did not take the form of speech or confrontation. It did not announce itself. It was quiet, methodical, and inward, shaped by habit rather than declaration. If there was defiance in it, it was the kind that left no record except what the hands and memory preserved. She began, deliberately, to remember. The diary became more than a record of arrivals and departures. It became an attempt to hold the world still long enough to examine it. Each entry was written slowly, even when her thoughts pressed forward faster than her hand could move. She forced herself to describe things plainly. Names, when given, heights, scars, accents, the way a person held their shoulders or avoided her eyes. She wrote these details not because she believed they would matter later, but because writing them anchored her to the present moment. She numbered the entries at first, then stopped when the sequence broke down. Dates grew uncertain. She corrected them and then crossed them out again. Still, she wrote. She resisted the house by observing it. Each morning, before the day's work claimed her, she walked the cellar slowly. She traced the walls with her hand, feeling for changes in temperature or texture. She marked chalk lines where she had stood the day before, measuring distance by the span of her steps. She spoke aloud sometimes, namming the spaces as she passed through them, as though namming might fix them in place. The house did not respond in ways she could predict. Some days the cellar seemed unchanged. The walls held steady. The passages returned the same measurements. On those days, Hannah allowed herself a brief sense of relief. She told herself that the other days were aberrations, products of exhaustion. Other days, the spaces did not align. A corner would appear where none had been before. A passage would curve gently when it had once been straight. The chalk marks would be smudged or absent, though no one else had been there. She did not panic. Panic, she had learned, wasted time and energy. Instead, she noted the changes and adjusted. She brought food to the places where people had last been seen, even when she could no longer find them. She set down water and bread and waited, listening for movement. Sometimes the food was gone when she returned. Sometimes it was untouched. She resisted by caring for the people she could still reach. Those who remained in the upper cellar received her full attention. She cleaned wounds meticulously. She sat with the ill, wiping sweat from their faces and murmuring reassurances she did not fully believe. She taught children to remain silent by turning it into a game, counting breaths together, pressing fingers to lips not in fear, but in focus. She did not tell them everything. She told them only what was necessary. That safety lay in stillness. That patience was a form of protection. At night, when the house grew loud with its quiet sounds, she resisted by staying awake. She sat at the kitchen table with a candle and her diary, writing until her eyes burned. She wrote not only of the house, but of the world beyond it, of laws passed and enforced, of speeches reported in the papers, of the way men spoke of inevitability as though it were a virtue. She wrote of Thomas, not as he had been at the end, broken beneath the weight of a beam, but as he had been in small moments, laughing softly at a poorly told joke, standing in the yard with a tool in his hand, considering a problem from every angle before acting. She wrote these things not for sentiment, but for accuracy. She wanted to remember him as he had lived, not as he had died. The house did not interfere with these memories. She resisted by refusing to surrender her own mind. There were days when she felt herself slipping, when time folded in on itself and tasks blurred. On those days, she followed rigid routines. She ate at set hours, even when she was not hungry. She washed her hands before and after each task. She spoke her own name aloud in the morning and again at night. Hannah Grace Brennan, she would say, standing alone in the kitchen, "This is my house. This is my body. This is my mind." The words did not always reassure her, but they reminded her of what was at stake. The house continued to take people. Sometimes those who vanished left behind evidence: a shoe, a scrap of cloth, a drawing made by a child. Hannah gathered these items carefully and stored them in a trunk beneath her bed. She told herself she was preserving them, though she did not know for whom. One evening, a young girl drew the house again. The child's name was Lily. She had been quiet since her arrival, observant in a way that unsettled Hannah. Lily spent hours with pencil and paper, her small hand moving steadily. When Hannah finally looked at the drawings, she felt a cold settle in her chest. The house Lily drew was not the house on Maple Street as it appeared from the outside. It was larger, unfolding inward rather than outward. Rooms led into other rooms without regard for order. Stairways descended into darkness without end. Hannah asked Lily where she had seen these things. "Here," the child replied. Hannah told herself that children absorbed impressions differently, that fear could shape imagination. Still, she watched Lily closely after that. When Lily and her mother left, Hannah marked the date carefully. 3 days later, she heard a child singing in the cellar. The sound was faint, distant, carried through walls. The melody was unmistakable. Hannah stood frozen, candle dripping wax onto her hand, listening. The song ended abruptly, as if cut off mid-breath. She did not go down to investigate. Her resistance took the form of restraint as much as action. She stopped hiring workers for a time. She stopped commissioning new spaces. She focused on understanding what already existed. She mapped as best she could, though the maps never remained accurate for long. She resisted by refusing to lie to herself. In her diary, she began to write what she feared might be true, that the house was not merely hiding people, but holding them, that safety had become indistinguishable from confinement, that her intentions, however sincere, no longer governed the outcome. She did not conclude from this that she should stop. She concluded that she should bear witness. If she could not prevent what was happening, she could at least record it. She could leave behind an account that did not excuse itself. She could refuse the comfort of certainty. The pressure from outside continued to build. Marshals returned more frequently. Neighbors grew watchful. Hannah learned to keep her face blank. Her answers brief. She practiced normalcy as a form of camouflage. One afternoon, a woman from the church asked Hannah if she was well. The question was gentle, but it carried an edge. Hannah answered truthfully and incompletely. She was managing. She thanked the woman for her concern. The conversation ended there. Hannah knew she was being observed. She resisted by maintaining appearances. The house above ground remained orderly. The garden was tended. The windows were cleaned. She did not allow the chaos below to show itself above. At times, she felt resentment toward the house, toward its capacity to act without her consent, toward the way it absorbed people and left her with only questions. She allowed herself these feelings and then set them aside. Resentment did not free anyone. There were moments, brief and disquieting, when she felt gratitude, when the house concealed so thoroughly that even the most careful search found nothing, when people who should have been discovered were not. She did not know what price was paid for this protection. She resisted by continuing to ask the question, "What have I done?" She did not answer it. She wrote it again and again, in different forms, on different pages. She did not seek absolution. She sought clarity. By the end of that period, Hannah had become thinner. Her hair showed streaks of gray. Her hands bore new scars. The house continued its work, indifferent to her decline. Her resistance had not stopped the injustice. It had not reversed the course of events, but it had preserved something fragile and essential. She had not looked away. When the institutions that governed the world around her moved to deny what was happening, Hannah would have her record. She did not know then how desperately it would be needed by the time the year turned again. The world beyond Maple Street had decided what it would and would not acknowledge. The newspapers continued to print accounts of enforcement carried out efficiently and without incident. Arrests were reported as orderly affairs. Escaped persons were described as recovered property. There was no mention of fear, of families broken apart, of those who vanished between one place and the next. The language was clean. It reassured those who wished to be reassured. Hannah read these reports carefully. She did not mark them or comment in the margins. She folded the papers neatly and burned them when she was finished, watching the words curl and blacken until nothing legible remained. The institutions that governed her life did not come to her house to see what was happening. They came only to confirm what they already believed. The marshals returned in early spring, 2 men this time, both familiar. They were polite. They removed their hats when she opened the door. One of them remarked on the weather. The other apologized for the inconvenience. They had received another report, they said. Nothing specific, just a concern. Hannah nodded and stepped aside. She had learned that resistance at the threshold invited suspicion. They searched the house thoroughly, upstairs first. Bedrooms, closets, the kitchen. They opened drawers, lifted lids, tapped walls with their knuckles. They found nothing that troubled them. Hannah followed at a distance, hands folded, expression neutral. When they went down to the cellar, her breath slowed until it barely seemed to move at all. She watched their feet rather than their faces. She noted where they stepped, where they paused. One of them commented on the coolness of the air. "Old houses," Hannah replied. They examined the shelves, the bins, the barrels. They moved the furniture that could be moved. They did not move the shelf that concealed the hidden door. One leaned against it briefly, then stepped away. They left after less than an hour, satisfied. They apologized again. They said it was nothing personal. When the door closed behind them, Hannah stood in the hall for a long time. Her knees shook. She did not sit down until the trembling passed. She went down to the cellar immediately. The space behind the shelf was empty. There had been 7 people there the night before, 3 adults, 4 children. She had brought them food. She had spoken to them quietly, reminding them to remain still. She had promised nothing beyond concealment. Now there was no sign they had ever been there. She did not call out. She did not search frantically. She stood in the doorway and allowed herself to see what was before her. Bare floor, unmarked walls. The absence was complete. That was the moment when denial took shape in her mind, not as ignorance, but as a deliberate act. The institutions did not find the people because they no longer occupied the spaces those institutions recognized as real. The law searched only where it expected people to be. It acknowledged only what fit within its definitions. The house, in its own way, mirrored that logic. It hid people by removing them from the categories that made them visible. Hannah wrote of this in her diary, carefully, without metaphor. She did not attribute intention to the house. She described only what she observed, that people vanished when danger approached, that concealment deepened rather than released. She did not know whether this was protection or erasure. Outside, the mechanisms of authority continued to operate smoothly. Warrants were issued. Rewards were posted. Men congratulated one another on a job well done. The absence of evidence was taken as proof of success. Neighbors accepted this easily. It was comforting to believe that order had been restored, that the problem was being handled. Hannah saw how quickly people embraced explanations that required nothing of them. She herself became part of that pattern. When asked, she said nothing unusual had happened. When questioned indirectly, she replied vaguely. She did not lie outright. She allowed assumptions to do the work for her. The denial was not only external, it seeped inward. There were days when Hannah doubted her own recollections, when she reread her entries and wondered if she had exaggerated, When she considered the possibility that exhaustion and grief had distorted her perception, the house did not correct her. It offered no clarity. The voices continued at night, sometimes louder, sometimes so faint she could not be certain they were real. She learned not to react to every sound, to distinguish between what demanded action and what could be endured. The deeper chambers, the ones she had commissioned last, became places she visited less often. The air there was heavy. The lantern light did not carry far. She felt watched in those spaces, though she never saw anyone. When she brought food down, she left it and retreated quickly. She did not linger. She did not call out. She told herself that those who were there were safer than they would be anywhere else, that the house knew how to hide them better than she ever could. This thought provided a measure of comfort. It also allowed her to continue. Institutional denial took another form as well. When Hannah attempted to trace the paths of those who had left her house early on, before the disappearances began, she found little. Records were sparse. Names changed. People vanished into new lives or into death without documentation. The absence of evidence was used to argue that nothing unusual had occurred. She recognized the pattern. The same logic that denied the humanity of those enslaved now denied the significance of their disappearance. Hannah's diary became increasingly focused on this contradiction. She wrote about the difference between what was recorded and what was real, about how easily suffering could be erased by omission. She did not frame these thoughts as argument. She framed them as observation. Her own body began to show signs of strain. She lost weight. Her hands shook more often. She forgot small things and then berated herself for it. She began to repeat tasks, uncertain whether she had already completed them. The house did not slow. People continued to arrive. Word spread that this was the safest place. Hannah did not correct this impression. She could not. To do so would have meant turning people away with nowhere else to go. She felt herself becoming an intermediary between systems that refused to acknowledge one another. The law denied the humanity of those it pursued. The house denied the law access to those it concealed. Hannah stood between, bearing the weight of both denials. She did not consider herself innocent. She did not consider herself guilty. Those categories no longer seemed adequate. When she wrote now, her handwriting varied. Some pages were neat and controlled. Others were rushed, the words crowding one another as though competing for space. She crossed out sentences and rewrote them. She left questions unanswered. She did not seek validation from the future. She sought only to leave a record that could not be dismissed as ignorance. The institutions around her continued to function as designed. They did not see her. They did not see the house. They did not see the people within it. That invisibility, she understood, was not accidental. It was the system working as intended. And still, she remained. When the truth finally surfaced, it would do so not because the institutions allowed it, but because time itself refused to maintain the lie. Hannah did not know how long that would take. She only knew that the denial had already done its work, and that she was living inside its consequences. Hannah Grace Brennan did not announce the end of her work. There was no declaration, no final act meant to close what had been opened. The aftermath unfolded as her life had in its final years, quietly, unevenly, with long intervals of stillness interrupted by brief, deliberate motion. In the weeks after she wrote the last sustained entries in her diary, she began to withdraw from the deeper parts of the house. This was not sudden. It took the form of small decisions that accumulated into absence. One day she did not descend to the lowest chambers. Another day she stopped bringing food beyond a certain point. She told herself that those within no longer required her constant presence, that the house, whatever it had become, would continue its work without her. She did not frame this as abandonment. She framed it as exhaustion. Her body no longer obeyed her intentions. Her hands cramped. Her legs shook on the stairs. She fell once in the kitchen and remained on the floor for some time before she was able to rise. She ate when she remembered to, which was less often than before. Food spoiled in the pantry. Candles burned down unattended. The house did not respond to her withdrawal with any visible change. It did not grow quieter. It did not grow louder. It remained full. At night the sounds continued, voices without words, movement without approach, the sense of presence pressed against the walls, not demanding attention, not offering reassurance. It was simply there. Hannah stopped trying to interpret it. She spent more time at the kitchen table, the diary open before her, reading rather than writing. She traced the pages with her finger, as though confirming that the words remained where she had left them. Occasionally, she added a line in the margin, correcting a date, clarifying a name. These additions grew less frequent. When she did write, it was no longer with the urgency of witness. It was with the resignation of someone who understands that explanation has limits. "I have done what I can," she wrote once. "I do not know if it was enough." She made preparations without ceremony. The diary was wrapped in oilcloth, as she had wrapped preserves years before. She placed it in a tin box she had kept for nails and small tools. She carried it to the cellar herself, moving slowly, pausing often. The cavity behind the false wall had been constructed for concealment, not convenience. Reaching it required effort she could barely sustain. She sealed the space carefully, brick by brick, mortar mixed thin, applied with a steadiness that surprised her. When she finished, she rested her forehead against the cool stone and remained there until her breathing slowed. She left one loose page on the kitchen table. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It did not ask forgiveness or understanding. It asked only that what had happened not be dismissed. "Let them know," she wrote. "Let them decide." After that, her days shortened. She stopped answering her door, not because people had stopped knocking, but because she no longer trusted herself to respond appropriately. On the few occasions when she did open it, she turned people away with directions given carefully, precisely. She did not explain. Explanation would have required confidence she no longer possessed. The house continued to hold what it held. Hannah Grace Brennan died alone in her bed during the winter that followed. The cause was recorded plainly. Her body bore the marks of long strain, severe thinness, exhaustion, hands scarred by labor, hair white beyond her years. Those who found her spoke quietly of how she looked older than she was, of how the house felt when they entered it, cold, though the fire had not been long extinguished, full, though no one else was present. No one searched the cellar thoroughly. There was no reason to, no suspicion that remained worth pursuing. The law had moved on to larger concerns. The country itself was approaching rupture. Attention turned elsewhere. Hannah was buried beside her husband as she had wished. The stone was simple, her name, her years, nothing more. The house remained. It passed from owner to owner, though none stayed long. Some left without explanation. Others cited vague discomfort, sounds at night, drafts that did not correspond to weather, rooms that felt misaligned. Stories accumulated, none were consistent, all were incomplete. Eventually, the house stood empty. When it was finally opened again, decades later, the world had changed enough to look back with different questions. The false wall was discovered by chance. The tin box almost discarded. The diary nearly lost to routine. Those who read it did so with care at first, then with increasing unease. The entries resisted easy interpretation. They did not conform to the narratives preferred by institutions or memorials. They did not resolve into heroism or atrocity. They remained what they were, a record of action taken under pressure, of intention overwhelmed by consequence, of injustice confronted without the power to undo it fully. The excavations that followed uncovered more than expected and less than hoped, rooms without clear purpose, passages that ended abruptly, evidence of habitation without evidence of departure. There were no bodies. There were no clear answers. The site was eventually sealed, covered, repurposed, marked with a plaque that simplified what could not be simplified. Time did what it always does. It softened edges, it allowed forgetting. But the diary remained. Those who read it carefully did not come away comforted. They did not find resolution. They found instead a reminder of how easily good intentions could become entangled with forces beyond control, how systems designed to deny humanity could shape even acts meant to resist them. Hannah Grace Brennan did not set out to be remembered. She set out to act. What remains of her is not certainty, but record, not triumph, but consequence, not silence, but testimony. The house is gone, the walls are buried, the spaces it created no longer admit light. But what passed through them, and what did not pass out again, has not been erased so easily. 300 souls entered that house. History cannot say with confidence what became of them. It can only say that they were there, that they were hidden, and that someone, at great cost, refused to turn them away. The rest remains unresolved, as it always was.